Okay, so this is the OHPA, Open Society for Politics of the Anthropocene. And I'm very happy that there are still some people, despite the coming Christmas and other vacations. Even happier to introduce even milder or milder.
Yeah.
Who is a fellow at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, and is one of the very rare specialists on green politics as a particular subject of studies. It's quite amazing. I think that is, while we all believe that green politics is more and more important with every year and every week, there are very few has been done in political science or in history on the Greens. And Stephen is pioneering this kind of work, focusing on the German Greens and their origins in the 1970s and 1980s. And Stephen is also a co-author of our respective book called The Tragedy of the Greens, Comparative Politics of Green Parties Across Europe. Stephen is working on his own book on the renewable energy as a political problem in Germany. And he's also thinking about his next book on Petra Kelly, which is the subject of the talk, basically.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me, and thank you all for being here just before Christmas. I really appreciate it. And I'm very excited for the chance to share this project. So yeah, I'm going to talk about Petra Kelly today, and I will tell quite a bit more about who she was in part of the talk. But what I want to try to do is to use her biography to tell a story about green politics. And I'm thinking here about green politics in particular in terms of green parties. And I talk a little bit about that in a minute. This is what I see. I'm advancing the slides. So I want to first talk a little bit about, why there's so little international history of green politics, particularly in terms of green parties. But I think this applies to some extent to the environmental movement too. Maybe that's something we can discuss further. And then I want to talk a little bit about Petra Kelly, about how she's been called by some people who've written about her the first global political theorist. So how in her case, as an environmental activist, she was someone who definitely thought sort of in global terms, and how that kind of contrasts with the sense of no international history of green politics. Then I'll tell you a little bit about her life and her career, basically, and about how she worked in the German parliament as a sort of globalist. And in the last part, I'll talk a little bit about her legacy today and what that can maybe tell us about Green Party, and maybe a little bit about this tragedy of Greens. So I want to start by talking about why there's no international history of green politics. And I think this is really interesting, since environmentalism, as we all know, is a global or international phenomenon, and environmental problems certainly don't stop at political borders. If we look at kind of the emergence of modern environmentalism as it's been described by historians like J.R. McNeill, who's one of the best known environmental historians, and he talks about the rise of modern environmentalism in the 1970s all around the globe. And I think that moment in the beginning of the 1970s has been linked with a lot of international or global events. So it's very clear, like the Earthrise photo from 1968, the publication of the Limits to Growth, and the UN Conference on the Biosphere in Stockholm in 1972, that these are things that took place very clearly in an international or even global framework, and that are always cited if you read accounts of, the beginnings of environmentalism. So this is sort of the period where environmentalism got its start, and these are the kind of events and things that clearly are all thinking on a planetary scale that are associated with that. And yet it's very interesting to think about how we then try to understand environmental movements to some degree, but especially green parties as a national phenomenon. So there's a really kind of disconnect between this global discussion of environmental problems and this realization. I think that's why the Earthrise photo is so often included in these discussions about the beginnings of environmentalism, because it was the first image of the whole Earth and changed people's thinking about environmental problems from sort of local events to things that concern the entire globe. And so despite all of this, when we look at the history of green parties, then we usually have a very national kind of outlook. And in fact, green parties first emerged at exactly the time of all of these things. So it fits with this narrative of modern environmentalism. The first ones, surprisingly enough, were in Australia and Tasmania, and then the first national one in New Zealand, the Values Party. Those were in 1972 and 73. And also in the UK, People was founded or these two were both in 1972, I think, in Australia and New Zealand. And then the next year in the UK, the People Party was founded, which later became the UK Greens. And those are widely considered sort of the first green parties. Already in 1975, the Values Party in New Zealand polled over 5% in the national election. They didn't get any seats in parliament. And already towards the end of the decade, in 1979, the first Green politician was elected to the Swiss parliament. In 1981, Belgian Greens were elected into parliament. So here we have a story that's taking place. And of course, to some degree, it makes sense why there would be no international history, since this is then sort of a national phenomenon. These parties, they're contesting elections that take place on a national level. But that's not the way that everyone saw this, especially in Europe, where most of these parties were and have been. In 1979 was the first direct elections to the European Parliament, and Greens from 6 countries, from West Germany, from Belgium, France, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Italy, works together. And here you can see, this is actually Petra Kelly, who I will talk about more, sitting in the middle of the table there. These are candidates from across a number of those countries. There's Solange Fenex from France, who are holding a joint press conference in Brussels. So as of this moment in 1979, you could even make some kind of an argument that, yeah, these green politicians, they're actually thinking far beyond national context, as makes sense with environmental issues. That's exactly the sort of things that Petra Kelly talked about when she was campaigning for the European Parliament as the lead candidate on the West German Green Party's list in 1979 about creating a Europe of the regions and thinking beyond national boundaries. So these first early Green parties from the early 70s that, kind of brought this topic, the idea that new kinds of parties addressing environmental issues, among other things, could even exist, but with relatively little success. And then this first foray into the European elections could certainly give the sense that this doesn't have to be a national project, that this is something we could think about as sort of a global phenomenon. And I think that this really started to change this account in 1983, when the West German Greens entered the Bundestag. As I mentioned, they were not the national parliament in West Germany. As I mentioned, they weren't the first Green Party to enter a national parliament, but they immediately became the focal point of people interested in green politics. Sarah Parkin, who was the co-secretary of the European Greens in the 1980s and one of the founders, or one of an early member of the British Green Party, wrote in her guide to global green parties that she put together at the end of the 80s. Although they were not the first party to gain representation in their national parliament, Die Grünen, the West German Greens, attracted the most attention. And international newspaper headlines closely covered the development of the Greens having won just over 5% of the vote and getting 27 seats in parliament. Parkin reported, in the United States, the US News and World Report warned that the Greens could team up with radical socialists to form a disruptive minority bent upon leading Germany down a neutralist path. The Washington Post said that the Greens could wind up holding the balance of power in the next government. All of these things would make very little sense to anyone that was actually closely following West German politics, because the Greens had 5% of the seats in parliament and were not considered by anyone as a potential coalition partner, but they were still this huge focus. And the Times of London reported that the Green Revolution marches on Bonn as a headline, and it spent almost as much coverage on the Greens entering parliament whatsoever as it did on Helmut Kohl having won the election and what that might mean. And I think hidden below just below the surface of a lot of this commentary, there were two aspects that made the German Greens rise particularly noteworthy. One was Germany's position in the Cold War on the front lines, and the other was kind of the relationship between the Greens as a new party entering parliament and the German past and what that maybe meant. And I think that second argument has continued to shape the way that the German Greens are understood and continued to frame all conversations of green politics, at least in its most famous case, as a sort of national story. And here I have a couple, I don't know how easy this is to read from where you all are sitting. You certainly don't need to read the whole of all these quotes, but here I have one quite recent example and one from sort of the early days of literature on the German Greens, where authors are basically talking about the way that to understand the German Greens, or the rise of the West German Greens, which became later the German Greens, we would need to think in terms of the German past. So in 1993, Andy Markowitz and Podgorski wrote that they would examine the Greens in particular through their Germanness, by which they meant the peculiarities of German political development since the Second World War, but also the fearful historical legacy left by the war itself. Boldly put, we believe that there are direct, if usually hidden, links, I made some typos here, between Auschwitz and the Greens. And more recently, Paul Neute, the contemporary historian, has written that one of the most striking peculiarities of Germany since the early 80s is the political strength of the environmental movement and the singular success of the Green Party. Why this German Sonderweg, special path, in the recent history of political parties? And of course, this term Sonderweg is very typical, it had emerged as sort of a way of explaining why Germany, fell to fascism, and what is this special path into modernity that the country must have had to cause that to happen. So it's very precisely chosen by someone like Neute, this term, he goes on to argue in this article where he poses this question that the country's Nazi past is very likely among the reasons for it, and not enough thought has been given to the parallel ascendancy of neoliberalism and memory boom and Germans' confrontation with the Nazi past and the ecological crisis. So these explanations of where green politics came from in its most famous case study don't have very much to say about those global environmental problems, and more to say about the German past and how this is a German phenomenon, which of course is interesting when we keep in mind that the Greens did not first, the West German Green Party was not the first Green Party to emerge, and all of these parties emerged in a context of concerns about global environmental issues. And Sarah Parkin, who I mentioned earlier, who basically, according to her, she wrote this book in the end of the 80s, Green Parties, an International Guide, because she was serving as the secretary of the European Greens and fielding so many questions about the different green parties around Europe, that she decided to just research all of them and write this. The book consists of chapters about each national case of the Greens. But even for this woman, Sarah Parkin, who was so interested in the Greens of the European and international project and so aware of how many countries in the world there were Green parties, she wrote in the introduction to this book that perhaps the thing that has struck me the most about the Green parties, especially those in Europe, is their parochialism. Not only is there a lack of knowledge about what goes on in other parts of the world, but a disturbing lack of interest too. Even the ambassadors of the richest and most traveled party, the Greens, or the West German Greens, well, there are individual exceptions like Petra Kelly, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, basically, are more concerned with a narrow sort of internationalism where foreign visits take place in a political and strategic vacuum and are often used merely as personal campaign medals back home. So according to this analysis by Sarah Parkin, who was, as I said, an active Green politician or Green activist, and at the same time, someone kind of, doing some research work on the Greens, or at least kind of presenting that research, presenting facts about the Greens for researchers, striking to her how little the Greens as individual parties are concerned with an international kind of framework. And I think this raises an interesting question about what we should make of someone like Petra Kelly, who also wrote a biography of Petra Kelly, so she was very aware of Petra Kelly and her work, notes as an exception to this, this rule. And I want to talk in the rest of the talk about Petra Kelly and thinking about what it could mean to what we can do with this one woman, who one political scientist called arguably the first global political theorist, who became sort of one of the most famous Greens, but so clearly doesn't fit into this framework of parochial, nationally concerned Green parties. And so, yeah, so Sarah Parkin, in that book that I was just mentioning, talks about Petra Kelly as probably the best known Green in the world and someone who has done more than anyone to spread Green ideas in an honest and inspiring way. And she uses Petra Kelly, I think, to talk about in the same book where she's, concerned with Green parochialism, to talk about a global Green movement. Here's the person that she identifies that with. Ruth Bevan, a political scientist, notes that Petra Kelly stands out as a global political theorist. She might arguably be the first such theorist in linking human rights, the environment, and peace. She gave global humanity a conceptual framework. She built or helped to build world organizations devoted to women's rights, unrepresented peoples of minority, indigenous cultures, children, and peace. She herself lived mentally beyond national boundaries. And I think one aspect that's very interesting and important in the way that Bevan describes Petra Kelly as a global or international activist is the fact that, as a Green, she doesn't see her necessarily as focused solely on the environment. In fact, what makes her this global political theorist is that she links environmental problems with peace and human rights, women's rights, the rights of indigenous people. And this is kind of a departure from a more, purely environmental sort of outlook that we might, imagine first and foremost when we think of an environmental movement, or maybe not. But I think that this is something that, some people would argue, especially in the 1980s, defined green politics as opposed to environmental activism or environmental problems. But that puts even sort of more of an impetus on the idea that this has to exist transnationally or internationally. And I think what's essential for all of this for Petra Kelly is that, in this famous interview that Petra Kelly gave in 1982, she described the Greens as the anti-party party because for her, parliaments are a place like the marketplace or the construction site where we can speak, bring our perspectives in, and carry information out. So she doesn't have a need to focus on national politics as much as some others might who are busy campaigning for office, but rather she wants to be in parliament and at the same time keep working outside. She links what she sees as work on life and death questions that we have to answer now within parliament, with continued protests on the streets, on runways, on construction sites. And parliament she sees not as a goal, but as part of a strategy. And that's how she comes to the idea that the Greens are the anti-party party. And certainly this is a bit of a paradoxical position, since she wants to be in parliament and at the same time to be part of a movement. But I think this kind of outlook is also is basically necessary to think about something as that exists as national political parties as a broader international framework. So that leads to this kind of question of if there is such a lack of international histories of the Greens, and if particularly the research on the West German Greens and the German Greens sees them as some sort of national German phenomenon, what changes if we try and tell the history of the Greens from the perspective of someone, you can quibble with this definition if you like. It's not, I'm not attached to it, but I think it's interesting that Ruth Bevan called her a global political theorist. And how do chronologies and national narratives change when we think internationally? So to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about Petra Kelly's biography in the time that I have left. So hopefully this will be sort of a more interesting, less theoretical part of the talk to some extent. One of the other Greens men said this of Petra Kelly: unlike the rest of us, she came from far away. Of course, that's not really true, because Petra Kelly was born in Germany. She grew up in a small town in Bavaria, where she spent the first 12 years of her life there. That's a picture she drew of Bavaria after she moved to the United States with her family when her father left the family when she was very young, and her mother remarried an American serviceman in the late 50s when Kelly was about 10. And then the family moved to the United States. And she grew up in military towns in the US South. And she attended high school in Virginia and Georgia in the United States. And so from the very beginning, she had a transnational background. So she didn't actually come from far away, because she spent the first years of her life in Germany. She was born in 1947. She very much experienced what it was like in Germany after the war. But she also had a long experience of about a decade in the United States, where she attended high school and then went to college at American University in Washington, D.C. She studied international relations, and at the same time, she became active in politics. She worked as a campaign volunteer, first for Robert Kennedy, who was assassinated during the presidential campaign in 1968. And after he died, she began working also with Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, who had been running against Kennedy in the primary. But then, of course, when Kennedy was killed, he won. Humphrey became the candidate. And Kelly worked with both of them. She became very familiar with American politics. And I think this is a very important aspect of her development, that she was familiar not just with how politics were in West Germany, but also in other parts of the world. But of course, Kelly certainly had a unique biography, but many other people who are active in parties like the Greens or in the alternative movements of the 70s, shared some sort of level of transnational and transatlantic experiences, with travel international and transatlantic travel becoming more common, and certainly with access to American cultural products and news about the movements in the United States. So this part of her biography is something that is certainly unique. Not most of the Greens spent 10 years of their life growing up in the United States, but at the same time, it's not a reference point that was so foreign to many West German Greens either. And she then returned to to Europe. She decided after she finished her bachelor's degree in the United States to come to Amsterdam, where at the University of Amsterdam, she studied European integration at the European Institute there. And from there, she went on to Brussels, where she worked for 10 years in the Secretariat of the Social and of the Economic and Social Committee of the European Economic Community. So she had a job, her day job basically was as she put it herself, as a Eurocrat, as someone pushing papers in this office of the EEC in Brussels. But at the same time, she was becoming more and more engaged in political activism and taking part in protests. She traveled frequently back to West Germany on the weekends where she was protesting. She was getting involved in political organizations in Brussels. And I think the very fact that she was based in Brussels gave her also, an internationalist, a transnational kind of outlook on what politics was about. But of course, she spent quite a lot of her time there sort of questioning the formal process of European integration and thinking about alternatives and about, bottom-up kinds of Europeanization and things like that. So this is, I think, a key part of her development and something that contributes to her view of what green politics is. And what was then very important for Petra Kelly, as for the German Greens, more widely put, was the rise of the anti-nuclear movement in West Germany, which began with grassroots protests against particular nuclear reactors. And Petra Kelly read about some of these protests that were going on and showed up at them and, wiggled her way onto the program as a speaker at some of these protests and brought messages from Brussels that, that she claimed to be representing the European Commission in a certain way, but from a sort of critical viewpoint where there were people like her were looking for exactly these kind of grassroots protests that could also, as in the case of this one in southwestern Germany, right on the border to France, be border crossing and involve people who are thinking in transnational terms. And this sort of activism was key for Petra Kelly. Was also a clear source of where the Green Party in Germany came out of. People involved in anti-nuclear protests founded the party, including her. But for her, these transnational aspects and the idea that you could link together local grassroots struggles all across Europe or around the globe, for that matter, into a political movement was essential to what she wanted to do. And so for her, the place to take this movement was into the European elections to the European Parliament that I mentioned earlier. And she served as the lead candidate on the Greens list in 1979 for these European elections. And she talked about how she wanted to create a Europe of the regions and how she wanted an alternative kind of Europe. And that's what the party was standing for. And she, the Greens in West Germany got more than 900,000 votes, but they didn't cross the 5% threshold, so they didn't get any seats in parliament. They got about 3.5% of the votes, and that meant that the campaign didn't succeed until they protest outside of parliament. I think, as you can see, this link between protesting and parliament was very easy for her to maintain. She didn't see any contradiction between that, and nonetheless, this election had a big side effect for the West German Greens, which was that it did qualify them for campaign financing, and they got a lot of money from the German state that they then invested in further campaigns. But what's interesting is that even though Kelly and a handful of others wanted to invest that money largely into European coordination or make loans to the French Greens who hadn't qualified for campaign financing or things like that, the party as a whole was not that interested in that strategy and wanted to invest it in campaigns within Germany. So this is really a turning point, as far as the sort of transnational background into a national political movement. This is, I would say, a big turning point in the aftermath of the 1979 European elections. And for Kelly, it was certainly also a turning point. She served as when the Green Party was formally founded as a party in 1980, the year after the elections, she became the party's speaker. She was the main candidate in 3 early election campaigns, and in 1983, she finally led the party into the West German parliament. And whereas that first aspect, the first decade of her life, I would say you can see the sort of, or of her political career, the first decade of her political career, not of her life in the 70s, you can see this kind of transnational aspect of green politics where, yeah, it's all about crossing borders, working together, thinking outside of national boxes. In parliament, she served much more in an international kind of way. So she traveled throughout the time that she was in parliament for 8 years. She was reelected in 1987. Then she took more than 100 foreign trips during that time. She spent, I'm not sure if these calculations are exactly right, but as far as I can tell, she was away from West Germany for about 500 days during the 8 years that she served in parliament on various international trips. And as you can see, she was mostly in the global north, primarily in Europe and the United States. But she did travel at least to some parts of the rest of the world as well. Here I have the most frequent destinations that she visited. East Germany was the #1 most frequent, with a lot of very short trips, but she also took numerous longer trips to the United States. Of course, her parents still lived there, and she was still connected with a lot of developments there, so it's not that surprising maybe that she went there. But she also traveled very frequently to Spain, and I want to try to explain why she went to these places and what she did as a way of thinking about how the story of green politics could continue to be international. And there are 5 themes that I'll just briefly mention of her trips and give a couple of examples of each one. Those were continuing this sort of idea of protesting within and outside of parliament, intervening as a well-known green in foreign debates, political debates in other countries, networking. So this fits maybe a little bit more with this transnational aspect from the 70s to some extent. Supporting foreign green parties, so basically intervening as a respected authority to try to support them, and bringing foreign debates back to the West German parliament. So as far as protesting was concerned, she continued to do that all around the world. On the floor in one of her first days in parliament, she and Gabi Gottwald, another green activist, pulled out a banner on the floor of the Bundestag while Chancellor Kohl was giving his government policy speech to open the parliamentary session. She also continued to participate in blockades of nuclear sites. She protested at the wall of at the fence outside the White House. She protested on the Alexanderplatz in East Berlin. She helped to occupy the West German embassy to South Africa. She was constantly protesting all around the world. So she certainly didn't come across in this sort of parochial sense as Sarah Parkin said that Sarah Parkin claimed was true of many of the Greens. Far from it, and rather she saw the need to sort of be just as active in places where she was not a citizen or didn't have a background as places where she was. And then what's really interesting is that she continued to she had no problem with sort of using her position as a German parliamentarian or as a well-known green activist to intervene in debates in other countries. So she visited Australia, and Australian press covered her talking about at the moment when there were big debates in Australia in 1984 about whether Australian uranium should be sent to France, which was testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific, which was not, frustrating to many Australians. And Australia was considering whether or not it should stop selling uranium to France or to countries that weren't going to use it just for energy. And Petra Kelly traveled to Australia at this time, and then she intervened in this enough that the press was covering, with cover stories about her discussions about what she had to say about this. In her travel report that she wrote for the Greens when she got back to Germany, she said, my visit to Australia at this time was perceived by many commentators, so by people like the authors of these articles, as very important because the Labour Party in Australia is discussing this uranium question, and I was engaging in the debate about it. And similarly, as another example, when she visited Spain, which she visited very frequently in the 1980s, she wanted to weigh in on whether she was very eager for Spanish voters to reject their remaining in NATO as part of the referendum that was held in 1986. She also wanted, there was also a big debate about whether Spain should join the European Economic Communities, which she wanted to intervene in and try to also convince them not to do that in order to build a different kind of Europe. So she had no problem with intervening in foreign political debates, and she did it quite frequently on her travels. She was also networking in two different sorts of ways. Here are two examples from the same trip to the United States shortly after she first entered Parliament, where on the one hand, she used her status as a very strong anti-missiles advocate in Germany to, as a peace activist, basically to get to give a speech at the U.S. Army War College, and afterwards she met with military officials and talked to them. You can see she looks, I think, very proud of herself in this image, and at the same time meeting with basically student activists at the American University where she had studied. But it's not just at places like American University where she had some history that she met with activists. She used a lot of her trips to talk with people, both government officials, but also activists. So there's another way where, with her story, green politics becomes something that is, that is transnational and international. Then she also played a key role in sort of determining which, in countries like Spain, where there were several different groups that became organized and said, okay, we're the official Green Party in Spain. Petra Kelly was keen to weigh in on these debates and decide which one sort of most closely matched her definition of what a Green Party should be like. And in fact, in many countries, in the United States, certainly people were asking her to say, give our party your stamp of approval as basically the sister party of the West German Greens. That's what we want so that we can prove that we are the real Greens. And so she was sort of this unofficial ambassador of green politics. Interestingly, all this was happening, and I'll talk about this a bit more in the conclusion, at the same time as she was kind of losing most of her influence within the West German Greens. She was still very well known abroad. And the last sort of example of what she did through her travels that I wanted to mention was that she basically brought the things that she encountered into West German debates, both through continuing to protest. So here at Wackersdorf, which is where in Bavaria the West German government was planning to build a nuclear reprocessing site. She talked about her experiences in Australia and the uranium debates, which she thought was relevant to that. She also visited Guernica in Spain and then tried to initiate parliamentary debates about German funding for a center to remember the bombing by the Legion Condor of Guernica in Spain. And she drew inspiration from people like Boai, the East German dissident and activist, or from the Dalai Lama, and talked about how these kind of movements against repression and how they influenced her, and tried to bring those into her work in Germany. So I think these are some examples of ways that through the career of a person like Petra Kelly, we can see, a very clear kind of international history of the Greens that doesn't seem to show up on accounts that focus more on the parties themselves. And what I wanted to then, by way of conclusion, is to talk about is her legacy and what that basically means for how we understand the history of the Greens. As I mentioned, Petra Kelly started to fall from importance within the West German Greens throughout the course of her career in Parliament. She refused to follow the rules of the party, which said that everyone had to rotate out of their seat in parliament after 2 years, and she held on to her seat, and she was so popular with the voters that she was basically able to pull that off anyways. But when the Greens in the first all-German election, so after reunification, did very poorly and lost all of their seats in parliament, she also lost her seat. And in 1991, when the Greens held their party congress in Neumünster and tried to decide how they would move on as a party from this crushing defeat, she ran again for party speaker and received, I think, something like 37 votes out of 1,000 delegates. So she was very marginalized within the party by that point. And she basically deplored the state of Green politics and said in her speech, who will save the world and who will save us Greens? And for her, she wrote in a paper at this time when she was preparing for the conference in Neumünster in April of 1991 about how different she felt things were between the passionate debates about the arms race and political blockade actions that have been replaced by a dead and green functionaries language, even when topics come up that should touch our hearts. Have the Greens, she asked, become a registered German club instead of the salt of the earth or the sand in the gears? And so she continued to kind of see the Greens as something that ought to be international or transnational, but which increasingly wasn't. Now, and just basically, in order to come to the conclusion, I will briefly mention that, and as you might know, she was murdered, or she was shot by her life partner, Gerd Bastian, who then shot himself and the Greens 2 years after she lost her seat in parliament in October of 1992. And part of the explanation of how far she'd fallen from prominence within the West German Greens was that the bodies weren't found for several weeks in their home because no one had come to visit them. But and interestingly, the Greens, did not immediately realize through some kind of wishful thinking that this was a murder-suicide, and held a joint memorial service for both of them. But I think basically, what then happened in West Germany is that she fell basically quickly from public view. But interestingly, that wasn't really the case in other parts of the world. So already relatively soon after her death, she continued to be of interest in other parts of the world, especially in Southern Europe. Here's a memorial stone at the Petra Kelly garden in Barcelona that's remembering her. And slowly there were also within Germany some memorials. But what's interesting about her legacy in part is that until quite recently, where there's been a new documentary about her and some more discussion about her, she was actually better remembered in a lot of ways in other parts of the world than within West Germany, or within Germany. So this is sort of an interesting aspect and something maybe to think about. She became, over the last couple of years, she has become more discussed in Germany. There was a big burst shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when there was a lot of this question, what would Petra Kelly say, was asked frequently, since the Greens were one of the strongest supporters of military aid for Ukraine, and Petra Kelly was known as a pacifist and someone who opposed war. So there was a lot of discussion of, well, what would she have actually said? Was she was she a human rights activist who would have said you need to protect the human rights of the Ukrainians in defending themselves, or was she a pacifist who would say, how are we sending weapons? And some of these discussions really sort of re-enlivened her legacy, which is being discussed quite a bit right now over the last couple of years. And I think, this is sort of makes it an interesting moment to think about her and what that means for how the Greens themselves have changed. Since in the 1980s, it does seem to me that the Greens probably would have been more on the side of, kind of very hesitant about sending weapons or intervening in any way in foreign military conflicts, whereas now they are not anymore. That's not their outlook anymore. So to kind of conclude, I think, I see kind of two parts of her story that tell a transnational and an international story of green politics. I think her early biography, where she lived in a number of different countries, really shows how a set of transnational influences shape green politics in West Germany, and I think also in other countries too, like, the sort of influence of the US counterculture or the US civil rights movement on other forms of activism, and some of the shared cultural reference points. These may have shaped the emergence of green parties in many parts of the world. And then there's a separate sort of aspect of her life, her internationalism as a member of parliament, which is interesting because, she no longer held any formal office in the party. She wasn't the speaker of the party anymore. She wasn't the speaker of the parliamentary delegation, but she was a well-known individual figure. And through her bully pulpit as a member of parliament and through the resources that she had there, she, conducted basically her own diplomacy in the ways that I tried to show you of, and really made the Greens, or at least her version of green politics, into something that was quite international. But I think her biography suggests that there's room to tell a story about parochial national parties and the global green movement, but it leaves open some questions about to what extent those two really connect together. And if it can only be told through, a handful of people, this global story, or what we should, how we should connect these two things exactly, if they're separate tracks or if they're really linked. That's something that I'm very interested to think some more about and maybe hear some of your thoughts on. But yeah, I think I've probably gone on far longer than I was supposed to already, so I will leave it at that and look forward to your comments or questions.
Okay, questions, please. Comments, yeah.
Thank you so much. It's so exciting, and I feel a bit stupid not to know about her. But now I do, and I'm going to read a lot about her. I have two questions regarding this parochialism and why actually green parties are, as you said in one of your quotes, doing this narrow internationalism that would be more like a campaign medal back home for distinguished individuals. And why do you think is it still the case? And you mentioned that she was pro the Europe of the regions. So that's interesting, this nexus between internationalism, like real internationalism, and this idea of the Europe of the regions. And I wonder if this idea kept evolving in serious ways, and if there is some kind of Kelly's legacy regarding this Europe of the regions.
Yeah, thanks. Well, they're good questions. I think you're not at all alone in not knowing too much about her, because she's been kind of forgotten, and she's experiencing something of a resurgence right at the moment. There's this really interesting documentary called Petra Kelly Act Now that just came out this fall, a few months ago, that I think is, if you want to get a sense of what she was like, that's a great film to watch. And I think, yeah, as to why the Greens are so parochial, I think it's a great question. I'm not sure if I have some ideas. I don't know, and I'd be interested to hear what you think or what others think too. I think, I think one of the questions is just like, by what measurement? Because I suppose every political party, to a certain extent, is focused on winning elections in a particular country. So sure, they have foreign policy as part of their question, but that's also could be perceived as being like, what should the foreign policy of Germany or of whatever country be in the world? And what they're really interested in is convincing the voters at home to vote for them. And that's true of Green parties, just as it is of every other kind of party, but maybe precisely because the sort of problems that Green parties claim to be interested in are so clearly global, it's all the easier to kind of say like, well, why are you not thinking in a global context? If that's what if you care about the environment and human rights and all these things, like how can you not speak out more? And yeah, to some extent, if I look at the German example, I mean, it's potentially changed a little bit. One reason could be because the Greens have gone into government a couple of times now, and currently the German foreign minister is a Green, and she's certainly like has an interventionist outlook onto problems in other parts of the world, at least in the way she talks. I don't know if that's so well backed up by things that she's accomplished or not, but like she certainly talks about things that way on in a Bear book. So yeah, maybe the very fact of no longer just being a marginal political party that's kind of fighting for its existence in the first place can change that. Yeah, so to get to your question of whether it's still the case to at least some extent, but I think it also speaks maybe to this kind of divided element of environmental problems that, like, if you look at nuclear energy, for example, in Germany, people were very concerned about the reactor down the street from their house. They didn't want that. And that may have been a doorway to thinking in broader context, like if we don't want it here, we also don't want it there. But it might also stop at like, don't build it next to me. I don't really care what you do farther away. So maybe that aspect also of environmental politics has some reflection in, some sort of sense of parochialism. But I do think it's interesting that there's just sort of no clear framework of like an international, a green international. I mean, yeah, of course, the green parties do officially have some kind of international grouping, and they have in the European Parliament, they cooperate, but it doesn't seem to have very much importance for them to this day. So, but maybe that's not so unique among other political parties. Yeah. I don't know. I don't think I fully answered your question, but that's maybe the best. And as far as the Europe of the regions, yeah, I think there are still people that talk about that idea, and it's certainly not one that only Petra Kelly had, or even that she necessarily first had, but also the way that she wanted to look at Europe. And there continues to be, talk about different ideas for Europe, although I think that, that kind of idea of Europe beyond the EU is not at its high point now, but was maybe something that was much more commonplace in the 70s and 80s to think about than it has become today, where I guess just even preserving the EU's existence has kind of taken up a lot of people's attention that are concerned with, international cooperation or something like that. And in a way, it also kind of fits with, it's sort of another interesting aspect of green politics, that it could fit also with sort of more conservative ideas of Europe of the regions, and about like pride in local places. Then, yeah. Well, thanks. I don't know if I answered either of the questions very well, but thank you for it.
Stephen, thank you very much. I have two questions, or maybe comments somehow. When you were talking about the German Sonderweg, this proximity of environmentalism, maybe, I don't know, German national psychology, or however you call it. I'm sure that there was quite a strong green movement within the National Socialist Party in the 1930s, where they would link the idea of a purity of nature to the purity of race. This organic link between the environment and the race, the folk, and which basically links to this discussion about the Europe of the regions, where you do have the very national conservative interpretation of this idea of Europe of the regions. And even before that, before the green movement within the National Socialist Party, so basically green Nazis, there was a German movement of Wandervogel. Those young guys who would protest against the industrialization of Germany and would rather hike in the nature to feel this link towards nature. So maybe there's also a part of this Sonderweg that you were describing. And the second question comes from, I was doing research on Russian influence and Soviet influence. The description of Petra Kelly very, very much fits into the picture of a Stasi agent. And I double checked, and her partner, who killed her, right? Yeah. He worked. He was recruited by the Stasi. He was part of the organization that was set up in West Germany by the Stasi agents And I wonder if anyone looked into the Stasi archives to find out whether there was a link between Petra Kelly and Soviet active measures. And the Soviets, they invested loads of money and energy into setting up all those front organizations that, about peace and anti-nuclear movements. This fits very much into what they were doing.
Yeah, okay, two great points and questions. As far as the Sonderweg, yeah, I mean, absolutely, there are, a lot has been written about how there's a famous, edited volume, How Green Were the Nazis, that looks at, studies National Socialism from a lot of perspectives to kind of think about, what's the relationship between the environmental movement or the nature protection movement and the Nazis, and what things they actually did, and how we should interpret all that. So it's absolutely there, and there's a lot to think about in that regard. And yeah, so that there's no doubt about that. I think that a lot of the reason that this Sonderweg comes up in discussions of the Greens, the German Greens, has to do also with basically not just the idea that there is ideas about nature have a long-standing place in German politics from the Nazis to the left and things like that, but also with the sense of like the Greens as sort of a response to a belated response, sort of part of the generational conflict in West Germany, and kind of like pushback against the way that by young people who perceive Germany as still not having dealt enough with its fascist past and things like that. So yeah, so there's a lot of aspects in which this sort of Sonderweg story could come into play. And I guess that's what makes it so interesting to think about that, okay, the German Greens are particularly well known. They've been relatively successful as far as in terms of their electoral fortunes, like in being able to consistently get elected to parliament in comparison to some other Green parties. But are they really the only Greens that are worth looking at, or are they really so different from the other? Or how, if this is such a German phenomenon, why does it also exist in places that aren't Germany, basically? And as far as the Russian influence and Stasi influence, yeah, Gerd Bastian was a member of the Generals for Peace, which was a group that was supported by the East German government. It's as far their Stasi files have, I think, in the meantime, been looked at. The thing is that they were not East Germans, so they were not informelle Mitarbeiter, like people who could have been Stasi agents. Basically, they could have been. It is of course possible that they were part of the East German foreign intelligence. Those files don't exist anymore because they were destroyed. So that question won't be answered conclusively on the basis of of archival evidence. As far as Petra Kelly in particular, I certainly see your point that it fits some of the trajectories, but it's also, and it could certainly be true, but it seems unlikely to the extent that she also protested. She was arrested in East Berlin. She, was confronted Gorbachev at a meeting with him publicly and things like that. So it's of course possible that this is all just part of establishing even better the credentials of not being part of the East German system, but it seems for the East, the Soviet or East German.
And they were friends with Lev Kopelev, right?
Yeah, they were.
Sure.
Yeah, she was a tremendous supporter of East German dissidents and also of some Soviet dissidents too. So, but there will be no disproving that, and it does fit to some extent her biography.
But what happened? So she supported Kopelev when he immigrated, or what happened between them?
I don't know exactly. She was a supporter of him, but I don't know exactly what she did. I could tell you more for some of the East German. Like she traveled very frequently to East Germany at a time when most of the West German Greens were very uninterested in East Germany and supplied the dissidents with typewriters and things like. She brought things like that into the East. But certainly that does not rule out that she could still have been under the influence of the Stasi or paid by them or all sorts of things.
Yeah, thank you very much for your lecture. And maybe I have some other points, but I would say these are quite serious sort of things to imply in the absence of evidence, and perhaps it would be best to tread carefully about this. And at the same time, as a member of the Bundestag, I imagine she would have been conversely surveilled quite intensely for exactly this type of suspicions at the sort of still during the Cold War. But I have several questions, but perhaps in light of your project, but also of the upcoming volume you announced. And one of them was you sort of made quite a big point about her being potentially a first global theorist. And I'm wondering whether it's worth, for one, quite insisting so much on this, simply because, as you, I'm sure, well know, there's quite a long tradition of women in international relations and as global theorists, and from the League of Nations and the League for Peace and Freedom and emphasizing disarmament. This has very much been a certain kind of tradition and political thought very much embraced by women. And I say that this is relevant because one thing I wanted to ask is whether you plan to think of the destiny of the Greens in West Germany in relation to the women's movement and the feminist movement to which Petra Kelly was strongly attached. And I say this based on her essays and so on. So it's non-violence, it's the Green movement, and it's the women's movement that seem to be their pillars of involvement. So I'm wondering, how would you comment on that? Whether you see the development of the Greens in Germany as linked to an extent to the other non-left or left, but not really traditional left movement developing at the time. And thirdly, I'm wondering whether the framework of, you sort of keep saying, well, the Greens are a party, but they sort of didn't behave like a party, and she sort of transcended that. I'm wondering whether the party frame might not be the best way to think of it entirely of the Greens. So yes, they behave like a party, but maybe much like historically socialists have done, they were internationalists. And maybe this kind of global transnational movements parallel to socialism, and in a way a Cold War response to socialist internationalism of its own kind, might be more fruitful. So she's not a socialist, most likely, right? But she's sort of a left sensibility green activist. So she does something between the two. And I guess the parallel now would be sort of the part of the Linke that sees itself very much as a Bewegungspartei, right? So still in the streets with the young people who support them, and then you have other factions of the Linke that are quite upset about that. So I'm wondering whether it's possible to reframe this in a longer history of internationalism. But I guess just to pose a real question to you, what would be the stakes of your project as you see it? So is it a biographical? Because you've said, in fact, very little about what were the key points she was making in these international travels? What were the global issues that she was advocating for beyond sort of green parties in general? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, those are some great points and questions. For the first point, yeah, I absolutely take your point that she was not the first global political theorist, and I don't know if she would even have called herself a global political theorist or not. I'm sure she wouldn't have said she was the first, because she was very well read historically, and she was aware of longer traditions. So this was what this one political scientist wrote of her with Bevin, and yeah, it would be I shouldn't just put that out there without kind of qualifying it or thinking about the stakes of putting that way and what it says. It's a very good point, and well taken. I do think that the idea of sort of women as international theorists and women and a tradition of women in political thought would be important to incorporate into the project about Petra Kelly, and thinking about, like, whether there's a gendered aspect to her contributions or kind of how that fits. So it's something to take up more, and that maybe links a little bit with your point about the women's movement. I mean, Petra Kelly perceived of herself as a feminist, absolutely. She was not always fully embraced by the German women's movement, but that didn't stop her from identifying with it, and certainly she had quite a lot to say about issues and causes that were clearly things that were of concern to the women's movement. But yeah, and yeah, thanks also a lot for your point about the Greens as a party and whether they behave as a party. And I guess the point that you make there is very interesting to me, and it's something I thought about a little as I'm preparing this, as I'm kind of thinking about this project and how I want to do it. Is at the very early stages. And, you know, there is sort of an interesting comparison between socialist internationalism maybe and green internationalism, in the sense that the green one doesn't seem to exist in the same way, or it certainly doesn't have like the, like, still to this day exists in at least to some degree, you know, idea of socialist internationalism. Like green internationalism, I just don't think is like a thing that exists to that extent. So I think that's interesting, like why that would be. With this idea of like, yeah, Die Linke as a Bewegungspartei, I think this is absolutely what Petra Kelly was aiming towards. And in the early 80s, maybe also what some other people in the Greens were interested in, but not in the German Greens, but not that many of them. And that's part of why she became, yeah, such a sort of outsider within the party that she was the best known representative of. And I guess that's why. So basically what I'm working on right now is just a project about her international trips while she was in Parliament. And it's a sort of smaller aspect of this, and looking at what she did there, and what I tried to tell a little bit about, as you rightfully pointed out. I could tell some more about exactly what she was engaged in on those trips. And I'm trying to think of how does that one part of the story fit into a larger story. And what I kind of come up with was that it's very interesting how her biography could be used to tell an international story of green politics that isn't typically told in that way. But that doesn't mean, yeah, that that's the most fruitful way to think of her. There have been a couple of biographies written about her, and what I was kind of interested in trying to do is think about, you know, how can you tell the story that pays respect to like her as a person, tells her back, but it's not just a biography of her, but kind of puts her into a broader context. And the idea I had come up with was as green politics as a global movement. But you know, I have to think about that some more, and you've made some points that make it worth reconsidering. So yeah, thanks a lot for these points. They're all really good points, and they give me a lot to think about.
So what happened between her husband and her? And
well, I mean, so it's a little bit on. What happened is that at some time in the morning, while she was like 4 in the morning or something, she was still asleep. He woke up and began like working at something on his typewriter, and then stopped in mid-sentence or something, and then shot her, and then shot himself. So she was asleep, and he was obviously not, since he was the shooter of both of them. And then they were found a couple of weeks later in their apartment in Bonn. As far as why it happened exactly, it's not really known. There are a couple of different theories. I mean, one is that like Petra Kelly suffered from a lot of health issues. She like basically overworked herself, and needed help from other people to deal with the amount of things that she was doing, and she relied on him a lot. And he was older than her, significantly older, and was also like not in the best of health. So there's one theory that basically he just decided that like he could no longer support her, and therefore he needed to like take them both out of the world. Something like that. There's a theory also that they had agreed to have their Stasi records unsealed, and he kept like not signing the things quickly enough. So this gets into your point, of course, and that like he just really didn't want it to come out, and that's why that he killed her and him. It could be like the most common theory is that in that regard is just that he was upset about what would be told about him. It could also be he didn't know what would be said about her. So these are like some of the theories, but no one really knows exactly why he shot her. And the police initially ruled it a double suicide, even though there was no evidence like she didn't leave a note. She had appointments on her calendar upcoming. She hadn't expressed suicidal thoughts to anyone. So there's no reason to really think that. And later they revised the cause of death to murder, but that's about all that's known. There's also, I think, a documentary from a few years ago about that, although I haven't watched it, that just focuses on, why was she killed? That's the part of the story that kind of like grabbed a lot of attention about her in the 90s, as opposed to like all the things that she actually did during her life. So it's an interesting aspect.
Did they have children?
No, she was Bastian, her partner did have children. He was actually still married to his wife, and they had been living together though for a decade at that time, or a pair for a decade and living together for most of that time as well. She didn't have any children. She had a Tibetan. She sponsored a Tibetan child. So she like made a big deal of that. Like if you read her descriptions of herself, she says that she's the sponsor of a Tibetan child, but the child didn't actually live with them. She still lived in Tibet, and Petra Kelly just contributed to her costs of living. So.
Do they have like state funeral, or
No,
did she have?
They had this this ceremony this was at the like at the Beethoven Halle, I think, in Bonn, which is like the biggest sort of like center in Bonn. The Greens rented that out, and that's the only ceremony that they had. And then like a year or so later, that's her grave in Würzburg, which is just in a regular cemetery, and that was there was also like a ceremony when that was unveiled, but not like a major state,
Wow. Nothing else? Well, thank you very, very much. It was
Thank you
very
all.
engaging. There is a small reception behind the corner,
Thank you very
and
much.
refreshments.
Thanks for the great question.
It was very interesting. Thank you. I had many questions actually because it was actually very interesting to listen.
Thank you so much. Your questions were really helpful. So thank you for those.
I mean, I know